Good afternoon. Welcome to Ranchers Thursday Lunchtime Series. I am Paul Beck. I'm a Beef Extension Nutrition Specialist at the Oklahoma State Department of Animal and Food Sciences. I'm going to be moderator for today's meeting again. Dave, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name's David Lallman, Extension Beef Cattle Specialist here at Oklahoma State. Thank you all for joining us. Just might mention that these sessions are recorded each week. Sometimes it takes us a few days to get them posted on the website. But if you'll go to our website at beef.okstate.edu, you can just scroll down to the Ranchers Thursday section and click on archived webinars, and you should be able to find any one of these series or specific videos you're interested in. Thanks again for being here.
Thank you, Dave. Today we've got a excellent speaker, Mike Trammell. He's the Pottawatomie County Ag Agent. He's going to talk to us about fall seeding legumes and reducing fertilizer inputs and the other benefits of legumes. Briefly about Mike, I think we're very fortunate to have him in our extension group. He's a native of Tecumseh with a bachelor's degree from Southeastern OSU and a master's degree from the University of South Dakota. He spent 10 years as a forage extension and research specialist at University of Nebraska and 20 years at the Noble Research Institute, or formerly Noble Foundation, as a forage plant breeder. So wealth of experience and lots of knowledge in this area, and really appreciate having you. So Mike, if you want to go ahead and get started.
Guess you can see those okay. All right.
We do not have your screen shared.
Let's see.
There you go.
How's that? Okay. Talk a little bit today about interseeding legumes to improve pastures and profits. Got a lot of questions, especially over the last few months with the rising fertility prices, about the value of using legumes in pastures. And so that's kind of what we'll get a quick rundown today, and kind of look at some of the advantages and disadvantages of using legumes in some of our pastures. So always find this kind of interesting. I think most of us probably got a copy of Morrison's Feeds and Feeding book sitting on our shelf somewhere. This is actually out of the 20th edition, published back in 1936. And even in this picture, you know, talk about good pasture provides vitamins, protein, and minerals for these young pigs that are all out on alfalfa pasture. And they go on to make the statement that you know, these swine that are not out on pasture should be fed alfalfa hay to get all the nutrients that they need. So even for a long, long time, the value of legumes have been recognized for feed and fodder. So grass and legume pastures. So we'll discuss a little bit about why we want to interseed legumes, go over some of the value of doing that. We'll talk a little bit about the adaptation and variety selection. We want to be able to select a legume that'll work in our pastures and be adapted for our area. And we can look at also some of the varieties that are available that'll help us be successful. We'll talk a little bit about seed bed preparation. And for today's talk, it'll be mainly about interseeding into pastures that are already established. So we'll be discussing a little bit more on sod suppression. We just don't have time to discuss starting pastures from new or total renovation. We'll also look at and talk about inoculants. I think that's something that's really left out of the discussion when we talk about using legumes in our pastures. Inoculants can really help us be successful in establishing that legume into our sod, or it can really eliminate or really limit the value of that legume for fixing nitrogen for us in that sod as well. And then we'll look at value toward fertilizer budgets. That's where a lot of interest is with the high cost of fertility. And then once those legumes are established, we want them to hang around for a while where they'll be of value to us. So we'll talk a little bit about management. So with any forage or go, whether it's grass or legume or mixtures, we want to have a nice, thick, vigorous stand of forage. It's maximize yield and utilization for our livestock. And a lot of things go into this, proper seeding practices, favorable seed bed, environmental conditions, seedling management. A lot of things have got to fall in place for us to have a successful pasture or to establish legumes into a pasture. There's a lot of things we can control and there's a lot of things we can't control, like some of the environmental conditions. But if we kind of follow some guidelines and really think and develop a plan, that'll help us be more successful, or at least put more of the odds in our favor of having a successful planting. Because we don't want to end up like this. I guarantee you, if you take a lot of shortcuts in trying to establish some pastures and legumes, there's no shortcuts. A lot of times it'll end up into a disaster or something you're not very satisfied with. So we, really want to put the odds in our favor. And like I've told a lot of producers, and this, I really believe this: the most important day of your pasture is the day you plant it. That really decides a lot of how things are going to be for the future. So why would we want to use some legumes in our pastures? One is to extend the grazing season. Legumes can help us out a lot there. The more days we spend grazing, the less day feeding hay, that's more money in our pockets. If we can extend that grazing season by adding the legume into the sod, maybe we're adding an alfalfa into Bermuda grass, more of a non-dormant alfalfa, and we're extending that grazing season into the autumn. Maybe we're getting on it a little earlier. Maybe we got some arrow leaf or something that comes up a little earlier, help us get out onto that warm season pasture a little sooner. It also improves the quality of our forage available. Say we're on Bermuda grass pasture, maybe that's got an average crude protein content of about 10%. Well, the legume could boost that up quite a few percentage points and just overall improve the quality and digestibility of that pasture. Same way if we're looking at cool season perennials such as tall fescue, we can also look at the quality of the forage there. And we also see now a lot of producers in the West sometimes are mixing legumes with some of the small grain crops as well. Of course, the main one everybody's interested in here recently is fixing nitrogen, especially with the high cost of fertility. Legumes can help us do that. But again, like that deal, there's no shortcuts. The better stand of legumes we get into our sod, the better fixation of nitrogen we will get. We need to have nice, healthy legumes out there to really generate that fertility we're looking for. And this is one I'll just touch on right here. I won't talk about it today, but legumes can also be a tool to help mitigate the effects of toxic tall fescue. This could be an issue for a lot of our producers east of I-35 that have Kentucky 31 tall fescue pastures. You see a lot of white clover interseeded into these pastures, and that's basically to kind of mitigate or reduce the effect of those cattle grazing that toxic tall fescue, just kind of watering down that ergot alkaloid that they're consuming. Also help boost those weight gains. So if we talk about extending the grazing season, If we look at the seasonal growth of some of these selected forages here in Oklahoma, those green grass are kind of our warm season forages. And then down, we look at some of the red in our cool season. If we take, for example, Bermuda grass or Bahia grass, we can see we're starting some growth in April. We kind of wind through the summer, and then we start to drop off in October. But if a lot of our legumes, say arrowleaf or hairy vetch or crimson clover, they can provide grazing earlier on that sod and later into the season. So it's actually extending us a few months on either side of that growth curve of Bermuda or Bahia grass. And so these are where legumes can help us out. The other thing is, it's basically what we call filling forage gaps by extending this. So if we look at this graph and see the yellow bar, it's a warm season perennial, so that's Bermuda grass. Maybe we've got some tall fescue on our place as well, warm and cool season perennial. But we still have gaps during the year where we may be short of forage and have to feed a little hay. This is where a legume, perhaps alfalfa or another legume, can help fill these forage gaps, helping us reduce our feed costs, have us spend our livestock more time on pasture. The more time we're on pasture, that's less money out of our pocket. The ultimate goal would be 365 days of grazing a year. That's what we'd all like to shoot for. But any of those days we can reduce, is money back to us. And no doubt, most profitable forage-based systems, a lot of them you see, are store very little forage. I mean, they spend livestock spend a lot of time grazing. And really, grazing is about 1/3 the cost of feeding hay. So, it's definitely economic benefit there for keeping those cattle out on pasture. And, hey, you've got the most cost-effective forage harvester is your cow, the four-legged forage harvester, also a four-legged manure spreader. So we can use this grazing livestock. We're growing forages and harvesting them with our livestock. So if we look at quality, this graph is pretty good. You kind of look at it, and annuals are usually higher in forage quality than perennials. And then we look at cool seasons are usually higher in forage quality than warm seasons. So that you can see our tropical forages like Bermuda grass, they would be on the left end of this graph, lower digestibility, little lower in forage quality. Our cool seasons are next, and then you can see the legumes, they're at the far right. High production, high quality, high digestibility. So mixing these in with our tropical or cool season forages can add a real advantage. Mixtures versus monocultures. Advantages and disadvantages to both when we look at interseeding Bermuda or fescue with legumes. Monocultures on average are, a basic standard Bermuda or Bahia grass is easier to manage than a mixture. If you're cutting it for hay, it's usually better consistency. Sometimes it may be a little easier to market as well. Where mixtures, if we're using those, they can extend the grazing season as we already discussed. Can increase yield, add variety. Cattle are kind of like people. We like to have variety at the buffet line as well. Free end if legume is in the mix. And then a lot of times mixtures can help you adapt to more different environments, different soil types on your farm, and just give you maybe a little better reliability sometimes on how that forage stand reacts to the environment, environmental conditions. So there's advantages and disadvantages to both. There's a few things we need to consider that can be risky. This is Oklahoma. Anytime we do plant, rainfall is imperative. We've got to have a little rain to get those seedlings germinated when we are interseeding. If we manage these mixtures improperly, sometimes we can lose some of the mixture. We can lose some things there and actually decrease productivity if we're not careful. And interseeding legumes is really not an ideal situation for a lot of our native grass stands. There are some researchers out in the western part of the United States that are looking like a yellow flowered falcata interseeded into native grasses as a possibility. And hopefully down the road, there might be some options there for providing some nitrogen fixation for some of our native grass stands. And, you know, establishment is critical. And I'll say this over and over, because like I said, the most important day you pull the seed drill out of that barn and go to the pasture, you know, you're kind of defining how that's going to be from then on your pasture success. So somebody was come to me, you know, producer say, hey, Mike, I want to start some, you know, grow some forage, interseed some legumes. First thing I'm going to do is, you know, I'm going to start, I'll probably look at web soil survey, ask about any soil tests they've run. You know, here I got web soil survey up here. You can see on the right, just kind of a farm I've outlined there. You can see several soil types overlaid on that. Kind of see what the soils are, what the properties of that area are, and that'll give me an idea of where to start, maybe what kind of legumes I might want to look at, and what might be my options for doing some interseeding on these areas. And, you know, start establishment planning. A lot of times, you know, it's great if you can start planning a year or two out in advance. You know, some of the things you may want to know is, you know, what's the previous history of this area we're going to interseed? What were some of the herbicides used on this area? Could there be any residues present? We're going to be thinking about what species or varieties, how many we may want to plant. And then we need to look at the pH and some of the soil amendments there in this area too. And like I said, you know, when we start buying seed, we need to inoculate, or are we purchasing seed that's already pre-inoculated? And also, depending where we're planting Bermuda grass, or maybe we're planting in the tall fescue, that's going to also dictate the time of year we may want to start establishing some of these legume species. And you've heard us say it over and over again, soil test. We can tell a lot from there. It gives us a base to start. So we definitely want to do some soil testing before we start planting in this area, especially say the pH is very low. Legumes are very sensitive to pH. We may need to apply some lime in that to bring the pH back up into a suitable range. And that will need time for the soil to equilibrate to that. Herbicide carryover, you know, it's something to think about as well. You know, if we'd applied pendimethalin maybe in that area, or another pre-emergent like Resilon, you know, or is there some residual there that may keep those seedlings from germinating? So it's good to have a nice field history of what's been applied in that area before we think about planting. We'll also want to look at legume adaptation. These are just a few legumes up here that you may find planted in Oklahoma. You know, maybe, you know, we wouldn't want to be planting red clover in an area that tends to be very, very wet. They like to have a little more well-drained soil, same way with alfalfa, where white clover or ladino clover could tolerate that a little better. So we'd also be wanting to look at whether we're looking at a perennial or an annual, and what time of the year we're going to get most of the production out of this legume. Some of the questions I may ask the producer that's interested in interseeding some legumes is, when do they want forage? How much time do they have to take care of pasture? Do we want to look at reseeding annuals or perennials? How much they may be willing to spend for establishing maintenance costs? And believe it or not, I've had a few people in the area that do have irrigation available, and that opens up a lot more possibilities when you do have that. So we talk about variety selection. There's a few things we might want to think about or avoid. You know, the first thing, go with forages that have been grown in your area and are adapted for your area. You know, if your neighbor's growing some legumes and they're successful, go talk to them. What are they growing? You know, when did they plant? How are they managing? Find out as much information as you can. Go talk to your local extension ag educator. Find out some information from them, what might work in the area. There's variety trial information for some of these. And, they may know somebody who's already planted some. Is it a newer legume that maybe there's a learning curve on the management? And what might be some of the potential problems adding this new variety into your pasture may bring up. Other thing is kind of the miracle forages. There's a lot of marketing out there and shiny bags and other things that can be distracting, but always stick with local and regionally adapted forages and varieties. That's always your best bet. If you know they work in the area, just always stick with those. Good example of this, if you're looking for a grazing type forage to interseed into your Bermuda grass, a legume, say like alpha graze when it first came out, a lot of people were grazing Florida 77 and Apollo, as you can see on the bottom there on the left. And that was after a couple of years of grazing, and those legumes, that type of alfalfa was disappearing, where one that was developed under grazing like alpha graze would hang around after several years, since it was actually a variety developed for that type of situation. So, if you're looking for a grazing legume, if you can find information on if that variety was bred for that, that'll help you be more successful as well. Excessive seed cost, shop around. There's lots of dealers out there. Always, if you can get a good deal, look for that. Cheap seed, there's a lot of bargains out there on the cheap side of things as well. A lot of times, look for that seed tag. Is it older seed? Look at the purity, quality, ask some questions about it. Make sure it's got good germination. Because in seed cost, you get what you pay for. And if you put all the work in to get ready to plant and interseed, the last thing that you don't want to have a failure because you bought cheap seed that didn't germinate well. So it's always good to look for the blue certified seed tags. Each state has this. If you see that, it's basically kind of a buyer guarantee that you're getting what you pay for. But the bottom line is, have a go, work on an establishment plan, work with your local extension, and you'll be much more successful getting ready to plant your pasture. When we start talking mixtures, a few things to keep in mind. Don't have to get too complicated, 8 or 10 way mixtures. Simple mixtures, 2 or 3 way work really well. Similar growth habits, and similar forage qualities, and a lot of things work as well. Here's a good picture of like crimson clover, orchard grass, and cemetics. Pretty nice chart here. Don Ball, retired forage extension specialist over in Auburn, Alabama, put together, looking at some of the legumes, perennial and annual, and some of the grasses that they work best with. A lot of things work well with Bahia, Bermuda grass, and this is by no means a complete list. There's a lot of other legumes out there as well. A lot of things work for tall fescue, orchard grass, and even our small grain or annual ryegrass pastures as well. So always kind of look for some compatibility, and this will help you be more successful. Established together. We won't talk about that too much today. You can establish grass and legumes pasture together from scratch, starting anew. But that's a little bit more complicated scenario that we won't get into, but it can be done. If you're beginning with an existing monoculture like a Bermuda or tall fescue pasture, it's a lot easier to establish the legume directly into that than vice versa. There's advantages. You have better weed control. You can chemically suppress the sod, reduce thatch, open the canopy up before you seed those legumes, give them a better chance to germinate and establish. The only kind of different scenario you may see is grass can be seeded in thinning alfalfa stands. This actually works quite well. But in all cases, it's very important, since we're dealing with very small seeds, and legumes are very small seeds, we need to have good seed soil contact. Time of year planting, if we're establishing in grass sod, say tall fescue, we'd look at probably February, early March. We're in Bermuda grass or Bahia grass, we'd maybe be looking at establishing the legume in late September through October. For sod suppression, paraquat works quite well. You can actually go in, and this is what I call chemical frosting. You could come in mid to late September, early October. Maybe the Bermuda grass has not received a frost yet, so it's not quite dormant. You could go ahead and apply 1 to 2 pints of gramoxone or paraquat onto there, suppress the sod, and be ready to interseed your seedlings in their no-till. Paraquat works quite well. It is one that is a restricted herbicide, but you can tell in about 30 minutes where you've been, so it works very quickly. Another option is use glyphosate. 6 to 16 fluid ounces will actually suppress sod. It's another way of doing it. You have to have a little bit more residue there on the pasture, a little bit more green leaf tissue in order to get good suppression for the glyphosate to really suppress that sod. But basically it's the same principle. We just need to chemically frost or shut down that sod in order to interseed our seedlings and give them time to germinate and get them going and reduce. That way they have no competition from the grass sod themselves. Soil fertility. This is very important. Again, we're talking about need your soil ready to go before we're planting. Legumes grow best at a pH of between 6 and 7. Now, if you go out there and you test your pH in your soil, and soil test shows you got a pH of 5, you're wasting your time. We're going to have to correct this before we can establish some legumes in that pasture where they can grow for any length of time. Legumes are very sensitive to pH. Also, legumes need phosphorus and potassium to grow properly. So we don't want to limit them with these nutrients because that's going to limit their ability to fix nitrogen that our grass companion crop can utilize. This gives you a good example of pH and sensitivity. If we were to slide that red box down to say in the acidity range of 5.5 or 5, you can see we've already locked up the ability of that plant or that legume plant to use phosphorus and potassium. So that's going to really limit that legume's ability to grow and fixate nitrogen in our sod. So again, pH, very, very important. Soil testing, very, very important. Comes to our seed beds, talk about no-till drilling. Depending on the weight of your drill and the amount of residue you have out there, the main important thing is we're getting good soil seed contact through the residue. We also want to control our planting depth. Legume seeds, like I said, are pretty small, so we don't want to bury them too deep. A lot of drills you'll see, some of the pasture drills, no-till drills will actually have what they call depth bands on the disc openers. There on the right, it's a depth band that's been installed on that disc opener for this Great Plains drill. We'd like to see those legume seedling or seeds planted about 1/4 inch deep. Because again, like you see there in the picture at the bottom left, that's some alfalfa seed that's very, very small. A couple other things on check on. A lot of these pasture drills do have small legume boxes and they'll have a seeding chart. I don't go much by those. It's best to calibrate those drills. That might give you kind of a rough idea of where to start, but it's always best to calibrate the drill itself before you take it to seed. The seed's very small. Check the flutes in the boxes, make sure they're all there. There's not any broken levels on them, and that they pull the seed nicely into the boxes and the seed flows correctly. And also check the tubes, especially the legume seeds, a loose tube or a Holdens tube, you can leak out a lot of seed in a hurry. Once you have all that, you find a setting that works well for you, write it down, so you may seed another pasture and you can go back and to your notes and always have that there and save you some work on calibrating. And this is just one thing. It's kind of a deal I noticed on some drills I see. Sometimes they'll have the chain drags behind them, especially on no-till drills. A lot of times we're just getting through enough of that residue to get that seed into those furrows. And we're getting enough soil seed contact. This particular drill doesn't have any press wheels, but we got the chain drag coming along behind. This is can actually uncover the furrows we just made. So I'd much rather see press wheels running behind these disc openers than chain drag. And also start with a clean seed box. If you got stuff in there that from the last planting, no need seeding things out there we don't need as well. And this is also very important. I knew a producer that called me, said he planted 20 acres, seed wasn't flowing through the drill very well, and basically it boiled down to he didn't lock the hub, so he wasn't planting anything. So little simple things like that we can do to avoid a failure. Definitely calibrate the drill. A lot of these legumes you'll see are planted on a PLS basis. So that's good to buy certified seed. We got a tag on there. We know what the pure seed percentage is. We know what the germination percentage is. So if we're planting in a PLS that's recommended of 30 pounds for that legume, we're actually going to be wanting to see, and that has a germination of about 89%, with a purity index in there as well, about 90. We'd be looking at seeding probably around 33 pounds in there, so a little heavier than normal. So this is where buying certified seed. The seed tags really comes in handy, so we need to watch our seeding rates as well. A lot of legumes have various seeding rates. They can go from really, really high, like some of the crimson clover, to very, very low, like some of the white clover. So a good rule of thumb for mixtures, though, if you say you were doing 3 legumes in a mixture, say the seeding rate for red clover, say we're doing 10 pounds, we'd want to divide that 10 by the number of mixed species in the mix, which would be 3. So you could develop your seeding rates for your legumes there if you were doing 2 or more. Again, here's another picture of depth bands and the press wheels on it. These work very, very well on controlling their depth. And, no-till is great going into this press sod. If our drill's heavy enough to get in there and develop some furrows and get that seed in there and controlling that depth to about 1/4 inch deep. Really conserves our moisture planting at this one. Another thing to be aware of is also the pressure on those press wheels. Some of the drills you can control those and move that rubber handle up there. It's on the shallower or deeper end, the amount of pressure you want on those furrows. But the important thing is good soil seed contact. I would suggest, once you got your drill calibrated, you're out there planting, the first pass, go a couple 100 yards, get out, look, dig around, see how deep those furrows are, see how that seed looks down in those areas and how much soil seed contact you're getting. Like I said, seed depth is very important. Here's a very good chart showing you some alfalfa planted in either sand, clay, or loam, and the number of seeds that are germinated from 100 seed planting. You can see as we get to 2 inches deep, if we buried those seeds at 2 inches deep, our germination rate goes down very, very quickly compared to whether we planted those seedlings at 1/2 inch. So again, seed depth, very, very important. Now we can broadcast, or sometimes it's referred to as frost seeding. With the broadcasters, a lot of times we'll want to bump those seeding rates up 5 or 10%, just because we're actually not putting those seeds actually in the soil with a drill. One important thing, if you're using inoculated seed, legume seed that has an inoculated coating, it's pre-coated, do not spread it with fertilizer. A lot of times the salt in the fertilizer will actually kill the inoculant on the seed and cause you some issues. You can also broadcast in the wintertime. A lot of people get out on the snow with these broadcast spreaders or in the middle of winter and broadcast seed, and just the natural freezing and thawing cycles of the soil will actually work these small seeds into the ground. And at the bottom right, there's a nice picture of the red clover actually broadcasted into some tall vegetables. Looks pretty good there the way it's germinating. Common reasons I see why some of the failures. A lot of time, seed planted too deep. We had a lot of other competition out there, wasn't suppressed. Planting too late in the season for that legume or too early. No patience. Sometimes these legume seeds may take 14 plus days to germinate. And then sometimes environmental conditions are just against us. It just be too dry. We gotta have some moisture, and conditions were just not right. Sometimes soil temperatures can be very hot into the fall as well. So if we talk a little bit about our legumes, in how much legume or nitrogen can the legumes fix? Well, I'll put on an economist hat here and say it depends. Infixation varies with the species of legumes grown, soil conditions, water availability. But a lot of times we'll see legumes can produce anywhere from 50 to up to 300 pounds of nitrogen per acre per year. Inoculant is very important. Each legume has its own strain of rhizobium. Alfalfa uses a type of rhizobium that's different from a white clover. So whatever legume we're using, we want to make sure we've got the proper inoculum, because that ensures that the bacteria is there to fix the atmospheric end that's available for our grass companion crop to use. On the left, you'll see some uncoated, or what we call a naked legume seed, while on the right, some coated seed. It's pretty common that most of the seed you buy now is already pre-coated, but sometimes you will see some naked seed. But that's getting pretty unusual to find naked seed anymore. But if you do have naked seed that you're going to plant, you will need to get the proper inoculum. Here's actually some alfalfa roots, and you can see the bacteria where it's created the nodules on the root. This is what's fixing the atmospheric nitrogen. This is a symbiotic relationship between the alfalfa or legume plant, and alfalfa in this situation, and the bacteria for fixing nitrogen. So you want to make sure that rhizobia is present out there in the soil in order to create these nodules on our legume roots. You can buy the inoculum online if you have some naked seed. One bag will do several bushels of seed. A bushel of red clover seed goes a long way. This is really cheap insurance. A lot of this stuff's $5 or $10 a bag. If you do get some, they do have an expiration date. Just store them in a cool, dry place. Try to use them up the season you buy them if you can. Sometimes I'll get the questions like, well, I've had red clover in here in the past that the rhizobium should be there in the soil. Yes, there's probably some still there, but it's always just good insurance to go ahead and inoculate the seed anymore. So if we look at a little cowboy math here, talk about the value of monetary value of some of the nitrogen fixed by these legumes. So if we looked at, say, 850 a ton now for urea, it changes every day, I know. That would give us about 92 cents a pound for actual nitrogen. So we could look at the cost of applying 50, 100, or 150 pounds of N per acre. That would be about $46 or $92 or $138 per acre respectively. Now it is cheaper to interseed legumes. So if we looked at red clover, say we're planting red clover into some Bermuda grass at 8 pounds an acre at a cost of $2.50 a pound. Say custom drilling is about 20 an acre, we'd have about $40 an acre into that seeding. So, that's saving us at an end rate of 50, that's saving us about $6, $50 at 100 end rate, or almost $100 at 138 end. So, like red clover is biennial, so so we could actually probably prorate that and add a few more dollars to the difference there. So we're actually saving some money, fixing some nitrogen there with these legumes. And like I said, here's a chart. This kind of 50% in, or 50 cents per pound of N. We can see we can still generate quite a few dollars on there per acre by saving, by having legumes in our pasture. So, but there is variability with the legumes. We can also get a lot of nitrogen fixed out there, which is basically protein and tonnage. So if we look at legume yield, as it goes up in tonnage, our protein goes up as well, along with that nitrogen fixed per acre. So this goes back to our animals, nitrogen converted into protein, putting weight on those animals. So this is our forage quality aspect as well. Here's a good visual from Florida. You can see on the far left, annual ryegrass without end, compared all the way over to the right with crimson clover and annual ryegrass, just the fixation of that nitrogen. Berseem clovers in the middle, you see it, also a lot greener, a little bit more growth, but not quite as much as the crimson. So you see different legumes fix nitrogen at different rates depending on the environmental condition. So just a few points on management. P&K levels must be maintained to keep the life of that legume in the stand. With some of the annuals, you'll need to manage them in a way that they could reseed, especially with like arrowleaf clover. It has a lot of hard seed, so we'd want to graze that in a way we'd have some bloom still out there and allow them to go to seed. Drop seed will have some seed for next year. And sometimes a light overseeding every couple of years of the perennials, say like white clover, will help keep that stand productive. Always defer grazing until the legumes are well established, because if we get out there too soon, we'll lose a lot of those little seedlings from just the trampling of the livestock. Another thing, legumes are not fertilizer free. Example on your left is a phosphate starved alfalfa plant, and then the far right is potash starved, while the one in the middle has received adequate amendments of both. So in order for that legume crop to stay viable and produce and fix nitrogen like we want, we'll need to look at those P&K levels with soil test each year. You know, and always give yourself credit in that soil test. You'll see what the credit you're getting back from the legume on the end, and fertilize it as needed from there. But yeah, soil test, save yourself some money. And then the last few slides, you know, I get a little question about bloat every now and then. A lot less common with grass legume mixtures. A few things we can do to avoid bloat. You know, don't graze immature forages that have legumes in them. Turn animals out in the afternoon, not in the morning. We don't like to turn out on a very, very wet legume forage. Especially don't turn out hungry animals. Always make sure their rumens are full when you first send them out. And you can also supply some blocks of some anti-foaming agents like bloat guard or some rumensin. And there's also some what they call bloat safe legumes. All legumes have some type of a risk to a degree. There are others that have condensed tannins, say like bird's foot trefoil, has a lot lower risk of bloat than say compared to alfalfa. So these are some things you can kind of research and see when you're selecting legumes. Start finishing this up, kind of a timeline, you know, start ahead, start planning at least 6 to 12 months out, thinking about the legumes you're going to plant, the areas you're going to plant them, getting your drill ready. Once planted, you know, let those seedlings established and defer grazing until they're actually up and going and doing good before we get those animals out there, because we don't want to lose those plants too soon. So we're looking at legumes, advantage of extending the grazing season, improving forage quality. If you got some toxic tall fescue, we can help mitigate that. You can no-till, broadcast, or do some frost seeding. There's options for planting. Always look at you know, your P&K to help manage that stand, the life of that stand, and improve your infixation from those legumes. But always, you know, there is a risk. Rainfall is required, and you know, got to follow proper establishment techniques. There are no shortcuts. And with that, I will take any questions.
Excellent, Michael. We do have a few questions in the chat. So the first one I'm going to start with is on the rhizobia inoculants. How do weather conditions affect those, especially when we're looking at drought and drier conditions after planting?
The main thing with the rhizobia is getting the, if you're having to inoculate that seed yourself, is getting inoculated properly. If anybody does have some naked seed that they need to plant, I do have a recipe for getting that seed coated with your inoculant and allowing it to stick without getting in a situation where it, you know, you put it in your seed drill and it just gums it up. But as far as drought conditions or anything like that, as long as those seedlings germinate and that inoculant's there, we're ensuring those rhizobia are infecting those root systems. So we don't want to, a lot of the soils have some native rhizobia, or if you've planted a legume there in the past and you're going back to that same legume, there'll be some rhizobia living in that soil, but it's just a safe bet to just go ahead and inoculate that seed.
Excellent. Got one specific question for very sandy soils in southeast Oklahoma. What legume would you recommend?
Oh, yeah, sandy soils. That can be a little tricky. Alfalfa tends to do a little better on those type of sandy soils. It's got quite the taproot. It can go after moisture pretty deep. I would tend to stay away from white clover that's stoloniferous. Due to the shallowness of that soil, those stolons will have a very hard time surviving. I would probably also look at probably like a milk vetch as well, that has some ability to survive in sandy soils, but really in sandy type situations, I'd probably lean to alfalfa.
Awesome. We have a question. Essentially, when you're planting mixtures, how much concern do you, if you're planting cereal rye along with a legume, about getting the proper depth with both?
I'd be more concerned about getting the proper depth with the, that rye seed is going to germinate a 1/4 inch or a 1/2 inch, where that legume seed is more likely not to germinate at a 1/2 inch. So I would, set my drill up where I'm more or less, planting to that legume.
Okay. Lots of drills also have those, small seed attachments that will plant it behind,
Sure.
and hopefully get both of them at the right, but that's not always available to all of us. We have with everything we're planting, there's always concern with armyworms. Can you touch on planting timings in relationship to armyworm issues?
Yeah, that's a risk. It's just, in the fall, that's just really, there's not really a way around that. Those crisps, those seedlings will be nice and lush, and armyworms will make quick work of them. It's kind of one of those things, once you do plant and you think there's a risk of armyworms, you need to be on top of that out there every day and be ready to, I'd say, spray at a moment's notice, or those seedlings will be gone very quickly.
One of the common things people are doing with wheat pasture is delaying planting.
Yeah.
What is the window for proper fall planting?
So yeah, you can delay planting as well with the legumes. I've seen them, planted as late as the first couple of weeks in November. It just depends on when that first hard freeze is going to be, and how tall those, if you can get those seedlings up a couple inches, maybe 2 or 3 leaf stage, trifoliate stage, they'll tolerate a pretty good freeze. So yeah, delaying, if armyworms are going to be an issue for you, delaying planting is kind of an option, but I kind of like to at least, I like to at least be planted by the end of October in there somewhere.
I have a question from Kevin Kelly about herbicides for weed control after legumes are well established without harming the legume stand.
Yeah, I didn't touch on that. One thing I'll tell any producer that's ready to put legumes in their pastures is I hope they don't mind weeds, because you're going to have some. There's not too many things we can do to control weeds and still maintain our grass and legume crop. there is a Pro Clova coming out, which is made to put over our clovers in our grass situations that will help us with some weed control. That's about the only new thing. Butarac 2,4-DB can be used, but you need to go after the broadleaf weeds when they're probably around 2 or 3 inches tall in order for that to be effective. If they get much taller than that, you may stun them, but probably not kill them. White clover can tolerate some real light rates of 2,4-D, but you're probably going to knock it back a little bit. There's just not many options there when we, start looking at weed control. It's just one of the things that's going to come with having the legume crop in your sod.
One question about native grass with a large amount of blue stem, tall grass prairie in central and eastern Oklahoma. Legumes and native doesn't appear to match. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's just the management of legumes and native grasses. It just doesn't tend to work too well. There's a lot of there's some researchers in the West working on that, like I mentioned earlier, with some yellow flowered falcata alfalfa. But just due to the nature of that and the ecology of that native system, managing legumes in them is just really, really tough to do. It can, and sometimes be detrimental. A lot of folks that are working with native pastures recognize there are some native legumes out there that are growing in those pastures naturally that fix a little bit of nitrogen for those grasses.
One final question I have. Now I've got two. Aside from expiration date, anything in particular that you should be looking at when buying an inoculant?
Yeah, so if say you're planting rose clover, you need to find the specific inoculant for rose clover. Now that inoculant may do a couple other clovers, but you need to make sure that it is specifically listed on there. And that's probably the most important thing out there, is to recognize that it's species specific. So there are some companies you can get on their website, and I have that information. You can shop through there or send them a question of what legume you have, and they can get the inoculum to you. But that's the main thing, is just recognizing that it is species specific.
Okay. Yeah, probably one of the more important aspects if you're looking at a fresh clover stand.
Yeah.
What are your expectations for red clover stand life?
My experience with red clover, especially east of I-35, it tends to act more like a biennial, but I do see some situations where it's a short, I call it a short-lived perennial. So, if the moisture's there and conditions are right, it'll hang around longer than a couple of years, but most time 2 to 3 years. And we might look at freshening that stand of red clover, either overseeding again or doing a little broadcasting out there as well. But like red clover, it's great forage, works well for us east of 35, no doubt.
As far as red clover, is it one that would have hard seed that would reseed itself, or?
Yes, it's got hard seed, not to the degree like arrowleaf clover would, but it does have some hard seed. So you can manage that in a way where you could get some of that seed set out there and ensure you got a little bit of seed for the following year. But what we see a lot of times with legumes like arrowleaf or red clover is the amount of legumes we start to see early spring going into early summer is very dependent on that rainfall. So you could have arrowleaf clover in your pasture, have a great stand, manage it, get a lot of hard seed fall. Following spring, it's pretty dry. Don't see a lot of arrowleaf clover. Following year, you get more rain, you get a lot of it. Kind of similar with red. So we're really kind of dependent on how that spring, early summer is going to be moisture-wise for what our legume crop's going to be.
Like we refer to those as occasionally perennial
Yeah, yeah,
varieties.
Yeah,
or occasionally reseeding varieties.
Yep.
Okay.
exactly.
Did have another question pop up, which relates to what you were just saying. Airleaf clover, will it work in sandy soil in south central Oklahoma?
Yeah, there's a lot of airleaf clover around here. It's pretty adaptive. You know, it'd probably grow on about anything except blow sand. But airleaf, I find grows pretty well anywhere in the state from 81 highway east. So.
It's also a fairly impressive plant whenever you do get those good conditions in the spring.
Yes, yeah, it
really
put a lot of
take over.
biomass. A lot of biomass.
Well, that appears to be all the questions that we have. Mike, do you have any follow-ups or anything you want to add?
Yeah, you know, somebody's got some questions, just contact me. Can help you out or see what, help you with some planning on interseeding some legumes. So like I said, there's a lot of interest right now, but there's a lot of things to take into account, especially with these dry conditions and things on what our fall will be. Hopefully this will break next couple of weeks. We'll get some moisture. So
Yeah, always hope for that.
Yeah.
The thing about clovers is or other legumes are so site specific. So what may work in one area of your farm or one farm may not work in another area, just depending on soil type and different conditions. So
that web soil survey is great for that. Producers at home can log in there, play around on web soil survey, look at your farm. You can learn, you get a lot of information very quickly from that. I use it a lot before I go on farm visits because I get a lot of information that I have available to me before I actually set foot on the place. So that works quite well for planning.
Well, thank you, Mike. We're about at the end of our time. I'm going to appreciate everybody for attending this week's Ranchers Thursday Lunchtime Series. Look for the videos for this and any of the other preceding topics from on our beefextension.com website. And we look forward to seeing you next week, where we're going to discuss deworming options for cow-calf operations. Thank you very much.